Hi everybody! Today I'm going to be giving my very first virtual art lesson. If you've been following me, I generally do body painting, but I post a lot of my drawings on Instagram. And I have given people art lessons before, but I don't think I have the most conventional approach to art. So I've really struggled with the idea of how to share those methods, if it's going to make sense to people, if it'll translate through video. And with everything going on right now, with the virus and everybody being at home, I thought now would be the best time for me to just give this a shot and see if it helps anybody. This video, by the end of it, we're not going to be doing like a picture together, because I really want to start with the fundamentals, even for people who, have a grasp on their art abilities. This is really aimed at not only beginners, but people who are potentially going to watch my later, more advanced videos, because what I'm explaining here will help show my methods later on, so that I don't have to explain from the beginning each time, like how I got to the point of where I'm at. Like, I really think that everybody should start here. Once you know the rules, you can then break them, and that's where you get like styles like Impressionism, just things that aren't realism, or like from life drawings. Like, that's where you get more of like the free sort of painting style, and that's great. But I think that being able to look at something and then drawing it will help you gain the confidence to be able to break those rules and to really create some like free and like emotional pieces. You can already do this now, and that's kind of what I'm going to show you. I show everyone that I've taught how to draw this simple trick, and within 2 or 3 lessons, or rather 2 or 3 times of them attempting this, like, they really get to a place where they're already able to create very realistic pieces and be able to copy what they're looking at. And this has been true for younger people, for older people. Like, you can start this at any age. So that's enough for the intro. Let's go ahead and get into it. So what I'm going to show you is that simple concept illustrated in a very small way. So you can do this. It doesn't have to be this exact sort of line, but go ahead and draw a line. And you see it's just that little curve. And everyone, when you tell them that they can draw, they're like, no, I can only draw stick figures. Well, here's where that concept kind of comes in. So that's just a line, right? It's super simple. It's just a little curved line. And most people, when they look at a line like that and I tell them, can you draw that exactly as you see it? They're like, well, yeah. And they go and they, they'll either sketch it or they'll draw it. But for the most part, they'll get it, pretty on, because it's a simple little line. And you can do this, you can make whatever line it is, and you can look at it and be able to copy it pretty exactly, because you know that if you're off at all, like if it's, too round at the top or this doesn't go down enough, you can correct that because you can see it. It's pretty obvious. It's like looking at a straight line. You can see that line and you can see how it would change like that, and it's very obvious to look at something and be able to see the difference. And so this is the first thing that I think is important to realize, is that this and this, most people, when you ask them to draw something, like if you're like, hey, draw this nose, they're like, see, I'm a bad drawer, and they'll quickly just like, draw a bunch of lines like really fast and not really look at what they're drawing like closely. And I know that sounds silly, but I really think that that's the first step in realizing that somebody can draw, is just getting them to realize that, no, my eyes are not different than your eyes. We might end up, if you take what's inside your head, it will always look different than what someone else is visualizing. But if you're looking at something objectively, the only things that really change is what details you decide to include or not. So like, for instance, if I was drawing a face, the decision to include every little pore could be made, especially with like, you see very hyper realistic pieces, but that's not essential to creating a realistic piece, especially if you're looking at an image. It depends on how close it is. So if I was drawing like a very, like just an eye and a nose on this page, I probably would draw all the pores because we're seeing, a zoomed in version of it. But if I'm drawing a face that's about this big on the paper, obviously those little tiny pores are an unnecessary detail, not really one that you would see to the naked eye looking at someone that far away in the first place. So the decision to, keep details or not just comes into personal taste and opinion, or what you can see. When I'm using a reference on my phone, for instance, or if you take just an image of something, let's just put an image here of like an eyeball. If you zoom in when you're drawing it to see those details, but your eye that you're drawing is still relatively small, at that point you're not even going to see those details if you draw them to scale, because you had to zoom in on it to see it. So when I'm drawing something and looking at an image, I keep the image the same size the entire time so that I actually am drawing what I'm seeing. And I hope that makes sense. I know this is a long intro with a little bit of drawing, but I really want to get down the fundamentals, and hopefully, it'll help some of you click with, what you might have been thinking before with your drawing ability and where you could be. Let's continue with these lines. I want everyone to try something like this. You should be able to draw any sort of like squiggle or line, and the important thing is taking that and being able to replicate it. So what a lot of people will do is really quickly be like, okay, and they won't, and you'll see that that's, here, I'll move this up. You'll see that that's not an exact replication of this. Like this one, if you're using your critical eye, I'll draw this a little darker because I don't know if you'll be able to see it. If you're using your critical eye, this part is longer, and you can just see that compared to this part. And if you really want to, you can do tricks where you hold your pencil up and just gauge that. You can see that this kind of has a flatter curve and kind of goes around, whereas this one's like a very round circle. So a lot of people, this same thing applies when you're looking at something in real life, trying to copy it. A lot of people will see it, but they won't take the time to assess each line that they're drawing and making sure it's as accurate as possible. So, and that's totally possible. Again, this is just one line, and if you take your time, like if I were going to copy this line, I would take my time. I wouldn't do it like I originally drew it in one fast motion, because at that point we're trying to copy it. So I would take it and I would, see that initial first curve. And what I do is that sketchy, motion. A lot of people when they sketch, they go kind of like up and down, and they create a lot of lines. And that's okay, but for me, that's a really great technique when you're like getting really sketchy for like gestures and for trying to figure out what you're going to draw. But right now we're copying what we're seeing, so we're going to just go slowly and do a little bit at a time. So we're doing that first initial bend. So it's this one that I'm drawing right now. And then we're going to take it over, because remember it has that kind of like that kink in it. Take it over, and then it starts to curve up. So already we're starting to get this shape. I'm going to draw this one a little darker so that we can see it for sure. And so you can already see this one's like very rounded, and that might seem like a small detail and people might think like, oh, that's close enough to this. But when you're creating an entire image, let's say we were about to draw like a hyper realistic face, when you're creating an entire image, you need each detail, like if you're going for realism, you need each detail to be as exact as possible, because as soon as one thing is offset, the entire image starts to become offset, because your spatial awareness in the drawing is becoming different. And this is the reason why people tend, when they draw faces, to turn them upside down, so they pay less attention to the full image and instead they pay attention to each little part. So we're going to continue this, drawing, what we see, and not getting caught up in whether or not you think it's difficult or not. Just, simply try to draw what you see. And if I'm using my critical eye and assessing what I just did, I would personally say that, this rounded part is maybe a little bit wider at the top. So I would go back in and I would take that in a little bit. And I would also say that this is a little too big. So I would go back in and make that a little smaller and a little wider. And some people, could sit there and say like, oh, I couldn't see those details, or I think it looked close enough. Again, when we start doing like a full image, you need to move as slowly as I'm moving and to correct those little details as you see them. Because you want to be able to look at something and realize that you can break it down in the same exact way that I do. I truly believe that. Because all I do is this. And that's what I meant in the beginning when I said I don't draw conventionally, because a lot of people, if they're, looking at something and trying to draw a face, they'll like kind of sketch the general idea and like sketch the outer edge of a face and do like a bunch of lines. That's not how I'll have to draw it darker. So a lot of people will, sketch a face, draw a bunch of lines. And that's not how I draw personally when I'm doing realism. Again, when I'm thinking of something or doing a new design, I'll use these kinds of tricks. But when I'm looking at an image and doing a realistic version of it, I break it down to the very minute details. So if I'm doing an eye, I start with literally just the tear duct. And I build that out, looking at the image, and then slowly build out and keep piecing it together. And eventually, you will get your eye. And then I go from the eye, and then I start going in and doing the nose based on the distance of the page I'm looking at. So I build it out very slowly. I don't do anything else on the page. I start in one area, because if you're using your critical eye and looking at spacing, you will be able to determine like if it's accurate more so than you would be if you're like trying to guess the whole big picture in something like this. So I think that's a really important place to start. I know like some people might be past this point, but again, when I go into like doing like a full hyper realistic piece, I don't want people to be like, did you start with guidelines? Like, where is your pen under sketch? Like, how are you just jumping into that? Like, first you have to understand this concept to then go to the next step with where I'm going to take you with drawing lessons. I hope that this doesn't feel, too basic for anyone. It really tends to help when I'm teaching people in person that this is how I start. And once people realize, oh, I'm capable of looking at, a little breakdown of lines, then I can copy it, and that applies to everything. Realism, and when I say realism too, I'm also talking about like if you were to take a picture of like an anime character, that same thing applies of like copying that exactly. You would just look at each little element and draw them as you start seeing them. So this page looks terrible, and I know if anyone like skips through this video, they're like, what is going on? But we're just going to continue on this path. It's just the first video. I think it's, a quintessential video for starting drawing lessons with you guys. So we're gonna do this thing again, but we're gonna do something that feels more complicated, but I'll show you why it's not. Okay, so we're gonna take something again that feels, and you're just gonna draw your own squiggle. So, and now we're gonna take this squiggle and we're gonna copy it exactly. I know people at that point are like, you don't know if you can do that, but I just showed you how that's possible if you take your time and you approach it from one piece on. Like, again, I wouldn't look at this and then try to just do it again by looking at it. Like, I'll never get the exact thing that I drew. Even if it's close, it won't be exactly what I'm trying to replicate. So if you do that in realism, you'll end up with something that probably doesn't look like what you want it to look like. So, and again, I feel like once you gain the confidence and see that you can create something just by looking at it, the rest will follow, and you will be able to branch out and, try more expressive mediums and break the rules and like really have fun with it. But I think this is a great first step to really like gaining your footing with drawing, especially for people who assert that they can't draw, because I promise you that's not true. So we're gonna go ahead and try and copy this. For me, if I was starting this, I would pick just an area to begin with. So I'm gonna start at the top, and I'm gonna do this first loop. So we're just gonna take it, a little bit at a time. You're gonna look exactly as a loop. If you're doing this and you do this, like if you do like a really sharp curve, you're not getting this rounded curve already. So again, that's why we have to take things slowly and look at it with a critical eye, because the rest of your drawing, because then if you finish the loop, it'll probably be too narrow compared to the one that we're trying to draw. So we're going to take it slower, and we're going to continue that bottom line and try and get that same angle, because again, if you like start shifting it in this direction, it's hard to maintain that critical eye if everything's shifting in a different direction. So, and that happens to me sometimes. Like, I'll start turning the page around and I'll suddenly get my angles off. So try and maintain the same, size and orientation as you're drawing it. So if you turn this one, also turn this one, like to get a better angle with your hand. So I am going to continue drawing this loop, and I guarantee you the first pass on this, like I'm going to make changes because that's using, your critical eye. I'm going to erase this one so no one gets confused. Sorry, I did body art, so my hand's all dirty. So I can already see things that I would need to change. This circle kind of has like a small, the point to this point is like a little more narrow, and then this is kind of needs to be wider out if I'm drawing it exactly as I'm seeing it. So I'm going to take that and bring it down, and this part has to be a little more narrow. And so we're just going to keep working it until when you look at the two, you're like, okay, that's the same oval. Because at the end of the day, when you look at anything like an eye, a person's face, an animal, all you're doing is creating, even if there's shading in it, what you're doing is you're breaking down the lines and you're just copying them down as you see them. And so we're going to take this line that's coming out from it, and you can kind of see this angle here. So that angle will help you determine the space that you're drawing next. So you want to mimic that angle that's between these two lines right here. And again, I know that this isn't a conventional way of drawing or figuring things out. I just know that this is what works for me, and it's what brought me from like feeling like I can't do realism or I can't do anything like that and just doing like expressionism, not because it was my preferred medium, but because I didn't believe I could do it. Like I didn't do portraits until I basically got to college, even though I've been drawing my whole life. So this really helped me, and since then, you know, I've branched out with, you know, what I can do with these skills, but for now I just want you to understand that this is possible. So as you're seeing, like this loop is becoming very similar to that one. And you know, I'm looking at the spacing between all my lines. I'm trying to make sure that this space is similar to this space, that this space is similar to this space, the same with this angle here and this angle here. You can see all of that, and I promise that you can. It becomes very obvious. If I were to do this quick again, you know, you would see the difference between that one and this one and this one. So we're just trying our best to get it exactly as we drew it. And I realize the line is thicker because I'm sketching it out, but these are things that you can adjust. Once you have, you know, the lines how you want them, you can then, you know, make them thinner, kind of erase and do like one clean line once you're sure the shape is as accurate as you can make it. And so we're going to continue this curve down, and I'm about to speed up through this, but I think you're getting the point of where I'm going at, where you're just going to look and take it slowly. This to this spacing is going to become harder without doing these shapes first, because your eye is going to probably space that farther or closer than what it is. So we're going to go ahead and do this. Cool. So, you know, my first impression, this feels a little bit bigger than this one, and so I think I would adjust that. But just for the sake of time, the idea is there that you're able to take this, replicate it, just by looking at it and judging the distances between things. You'll notice if this space is the same as this space, and if this space is the same as this space. Like, all of that just comes with like using your eye critically and not being lazy with it. So if you see a difference, rather than just letting it go for the sake of learning and being able to create an image that you're super proud of, go ahead and just correct those details as you're going along. I promise once you recognize that you can do this, everything else is going to follow. I can see how some people think it's a little more difficult when you get to something that's shaded, and being able to copy it even though it's shaded, but I'm going to do another video where I really explain how that works as well. For now, just pick things that have line work and just practice the idea of getting your eye used to being able to copy something, because the next step is going to be to do something shaded, and it will come so easy as soon as this becomes very clear to you that you have the capability to look at something and to copy it. Whether it's this simple or not, everything is composed of lines at the end of the day in a piece of artwork. Even if you're adding dimension with light and shadow, everything starts with lines. You have to start here. Every artist begins with some two-dimensional piece before they create a three-dimensional piece. And you know, that'll help you decide on like perspective and distance and like how long or short something is. Like that's what shading does really. It gives you that like fully dimensional piece. And even in like something like anime, like they create even though it's just usually like one shadow, it still lets you know how far away something is, because everything at the end of the day is 2D when you're drawing. So if you have two circles and this one's in front of the other one, then the only way you would know that, instead of that they're just like one thing that's attached, is if you have, sorry, I gotta draw that darker. as if you had a shadow between them, letting you know that this one was in front of the other one. So everything, comes in steps like that. But when you're drawing something by looking at it, those things are fairly obvious because we're just going to look at the dimension and the shading and just replicate it as exactly as we see it. So I hope that this gives you like a springboard into drawing, and this is not going to be the prettiest looking video. Like, I'm not creating something, I'm not teaching you how to do something magically right away, because I'm not sure if this step is going to be something that people want to spend a lot of time on, or if it's something you'll go quickly through. Let me know what you think of this instruction. Is there something that I could explain in a little bit more detail? If you're ready to take the next step, also let me know, because we're going to do something cool. And let me know what the subject could be. It could really be anything. I usually start with eyeballs with people because they're something you include in portraiture. They're the window to the soul, so it tends to be emotional and kind of a cool thing to start with. But I'm open to suggestions, so just let me know. Go ahead and practice. We've got a lot of time right now. So thanks for tuning in, and I'm excited to see what you guys create.